The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian as Elena Vasquez pushed her maintenance cart down the polished corridor. Her steel-toed boots made barely a whisper against the gleaming floor, a habit formed over years of moving undetected through far more dangerous places than this military installation. Most people who passed her saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a quiet woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the standard-issue gray jumpsuit of base maintenance staff. Elena had been working at Fort Meridian for 8 months now, and she preferred the invisibility that came with her position. She cleaned offices, repaired broken fixtures, and maintained the endless machinery that kept a modern military base functioning. The work was honest and simple, a welcome change from her previous life. The soldiers she encountered were polite enough, offering brief nods or casual greetings as she went about her duties. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that Elena Vasquez had once been Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez of the 75th Ranger Regiment. For 12 years, she had served in some of the most classified operations the military had ever conducted. Her hands, now steady as they guided a mop across linoleum, had once assembled explosive devices in complete darkness. Her eyes, which now focused on cleaning supply inventories, had once tracked enemy movement through night vision scopes across hostile terrain. The transition to civilian life had been jarring. After a mission that had gone sideways in ways she still couldn't discuss, Elena had made the difficult decision to leave active duty. The nightmares had followed her home, along with a hypervigilance that made crowded spaces feel like potential battlefields. The maintenance job at Fort Meridian offered her something precious: the familiar rhythm of military life without the constant threat of deployment. She paused outside Colonel Bradford Hutchinson's office, checking her work order. The colonel had requested repairs to his window blinds, claiming they were sticking and preventing proper light control. Elena knocked softly on the door frame, waiting for permission to enter. When no response came, she knocked again, slightly louder this time. The door swung open with more force than necessary, revealing Colonel Hutchinson. He was a man in his late 40s, with the kind of bearing that suggested he had never questioned his own authority. His uniform was immaculate, ribbons and insignia arranged with mathematical precision. His eyes swept over Elena with a dismissive glance typically reserved for furniture or equipment. Colonel Hutchinson said nothing, simply stepping aside to allow her entry. Elena pushed her cart into the office, immediately assessing the space with the same systematic approach she had once used to clear buildings in combat zones. The office was spacious, with a large wooden desk positioned to command the room. Military photographs and commendations covered the walls, creating a shrine to the colonel's career achievements. The problematic window blinds were behind his desk, and Elena could see immediately that the issue was minor. One of the adjustment cords had become tangled, a simple fix that would take less than 5 minutes. She began arranging her tools, moving with the efficient precision that had once made her invaluable in high-stakes operations. Before we continue with Elena's story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've encountered military personnel in your community or have family who served. As Elena worked, she became aware of Colonel Hutchinson positioning himself uncomfortably close to her workspace. She could feel his presence like a weight, pressing against the boundaries of her personal space in a way that triggered old instincts. Her fingers continued their methodical work on the tangled cord, but every muscle in her body had shifted into a state of heightened awareness. The colonel cleared his throat with obvious irritation. "You people always take forever with the simplest tasks," he said, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension that Elena had learned to recognize in her previous life. In the field, such attitudes had often gotten people killed. Elena's hands remained steady on the blind cord, though every instinct screamed at her to create distance. In her previous life, when someone invaded her personal space with hostile intent, the response was immediate and decisive. Here, wearing the gray jumpsuit of a maintenance worker, she forced herself to remember that this was a different world with different rules. The colonel moved even closer, his breath now noticeable on the back of her neck. She could smell his aftershave, expensive and overpowering, mixed with the starch from his uniform. Elena had faced armed insurgents with less tension than she felt in this moment, knowing that any reaction from her would be viewed through the lens of her current position rather than her actual capabilities. Maybe if you people spent less time chatting in the hallways and more time actually working, things would get done around here. Colonel Hutchinson continued, his tone growing more aggressive. Elena recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't about the blinds or her work performance. This was about power, about someone using their position to intimidate those they perceived as beneath them. Elena finished untangling the cord and tested the blinds, which now operated smoothly. The repair had taken exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds, well within normal parameters for such a task. She began packing her tools with the same methodical precision, each item returning to its designated place in her toolkit. "I'm finished with the repair, sir," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying none of the authority it had once held when she briefed generals on mission parameters. "The blinds should operate properly now." Colonel Hutchinson stepped around to face her directly, positioning himself between Elena and the office door. It was a tactical error that he couldn't possibly understand, but Elena noticed immediately. In her former life, cutting off someone's exit route was considered an act of aggression, one that justified immediate defensive measures. "That's it?" he asked, his eyebrows raised in theatrical disbelief. 3 minutes of fumbling around, and you think you've earned your paycheck for the day. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her shoulders, the same sensation she had experienced before every mission briefing. Her body was preparing for conflict even as her mind worked to suppress the response. "The work is complete to standard, sir," Elena replied, maintaining her calm tone despite the colonel's obvious attempt to provoke a reaction. She could see past him to the hallway, where other maintenance staff and soldiers moved about their daily routines, unaware of the tension building in this office. Colonel Hutchinson laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the kind of laugh that preceded punishment in basic training, the kind that meant someone was about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. "To standard," he repeated, as if the words tasted bitter. "Your standard seems pretty low for someone working on a military installation." Elena's grip on her toolkit handle tightened almost imperceptibly. In her previous life, she had been trained to read situations, to identify the moment when negotiation ended and action became necessary. Every signal Colonel Hutchinson was sending suggested they were approaching that threshold, but Elena forced herself to remember that this was not a combat zone, despite how it felt. The colonel reached out suddenly, his hand moving toward her arm in what could have been a gesture meant to detain or intimidate her. Elena's reflexes, honed by years of training and combat experience, almost triggered an automatic response that would have ended the confrontation immediately. Instead, she took a controlled step backward, maintaining distance while avoiding any action that could be interpreted as aggressive. "Sir, I need to continue with my other scheduled repairs," Elena said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but it carried the weight of someone who had faced real danger and survived. Colonel Hutchinson either didn't notice the change or chose to ignore it. The colonel's hand hovered in the air for a moment before dropping to his side, but his eyes remained fixed on Elena with an intensity that she recognized from her previous life. It was the look of someone testing boundaries, probing for weakness, determining how far they could push before meeting resistance. Elena had seen it in the eyes of enemy combatants, in the faces of those who mistook her quiet demeanor for vulnerability. "You'll continue when I say you can continue," Colonel Hutchinson said, his voice dropping to a tone that was meant to be intimidating. Elena had heard that same tone from drill sergeants, from commanding officers, from enemies who thought they held all the cards. The difference was that those people had actually possessed the authority or capability to back up their threats. Elena shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, a movement so subtle that someone without extensive combat training would never notice. Her balance was now perfectly centered, her stance allowing for rapid movement in any direction. Her toolkit, still gripped in her right hand, could serve as both shield and weapon if the situation deteriorated further. These were calculations her mind made automatically, the result of years spent in environments where hesitation meant death. "I understand, sir," Elena replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm. She had learned long ago that de-escalation was often more effective than confrontation, especially when dealing with individuals who were drunk on their own perceived power. But her eyes, trained to read terrain and assess threats, were already mapping the office, identifying potential exits and improvised weapons. Colonel Hutchinson began circling around her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. Elena allowed him to move, tracking his position through her peripheral vision while keeping her head forward in a posture of apparent submission. He stopped directly behind her again, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You know what I think about you maintenance people," he said, his voice now carrying a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than his earlier aggression. Elena felt every muscle in her back tense as he leaned closer. "I think you're all lazy, entitled, and completely unaware of what real work looks like." Elena's breathing remained controlled and steady, the result of meditation techniques taught to her during advanced combat training. She had used these same breathing patterns while lying motionless in sniper hides, waiting for targets to present themselves. The colonel's words were designed to provoke an emotional response, but Elena had faced interrogators who were far more skilled at psychological manipulation. The office door was still partially open, and Elena could hear voices in the hallway. Other maintenance staff, soldiers going about their daily routines, completely unaware that one of their colleagues was being systematically intimidated by a field-grade officer. Elena wondered how many times this scene had played out in this office, how many other maintenance workers or junior enlisted personnel had been subjected to Colonel Hutchinson's particular brand of abuse. "Maybe what you people need is some real military discipline," the colonel continued, moving to position himself in front of her again. Elena could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure he was taking from what he perceived as her helplessness. It was an expression she had seen before, in the faces of those who believed that rank or position granted them the right to abuse others. Elena's grip on her toolkit shifted slightly, her fingers adjusting to a position that would allow for rapid deployment if necessary. The movement was so small, so natural, that Colonel Hutchinson didn't notice. But Elena's mind was already running through scenarios, calculating response times, assessing the tactical implications of each possible course of action. The colonel reached out again, this time with more purpose, his hand moving toward her shoulder in a gesture that crossed the line from verbal intimidation to physical contact. Elena's training kicked in automatically, her body beginning to respond before her conscious mind could intervene. But she caught herself at the last moment, forcing her muscles to remain still despite every instinct screaming at her to act. Elena felt the colonel's hand make contact with her shoulder, his fingers pressing down with deliberate force. The touch was meant to establish dominance, to remind her of her place in what he perceived as the natural order of military hierarchy. What Colonel Hutchinson couldn't know was that he had just made physical contact with someone who had been trained to respond to unwanted touching with immediate and overwhelming force. Elena's muscle memory from countless hours of close-quarters combat training screamed at her to pivot, strike, and neutralize the threat. Her body wanted to move, to demonstrate that she was not the helpless maintenance worker he believed her to be. Instead, she forced herself to take a measured step forward, breaking the contact without appearing to challenge his authority directly. "Sir, I really do need to continue with my scheduled repairs," Elena said, her voice still controlled but carrying a barely perceptible edge. The change was so subtle that most people would miss it entirely, but Elena had learned to modulate her voice as precisely as she once adjusted rifle scopes. She was giving Colonel Hutchinson a warning, though he lacked the experience to recognize it. The colonel's eyes narrowed, and Elena could see that he had noticed something different in her demeanor. He wasn't sure what had changed, but his instincts were telling him that the dynamic in the room had shifted somehow. Like many bullies, Colonel Hutchinson was actually quite sensitive to signs of resistance, having built his confidence on encounters with those who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. "Did I give you permission to move away from me?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. Elena recognized the tone immediately. It was the sound of someone whose authority had been questioned, however subtly, and who felt the need to reassert control through escalation. She had heard similar tones from small unit commanders who ruled through intimidation rather than respect. Elena turned to face him fully for the first time since entering the office. The movement was fluid and controlled, revealing none of the coiled tension that lay beneath her calm exterior. Her eyes met his directly, and, for a moment, Colonel Hutchinson saw something that gave him pause. There was no fear in Elena's gaze, no deference, no acknowledgement of his superiority. Instead, there was a steady assessment, the look of someone evaluating a potential threat. "I apologize, sir," Elena said, her tone now carrying a formality that hadn't been there before. She was reverting to the speech patterns she had used when addressing superior officers in her previous life, but the colonel interpreted her formality as renewed submission rather than the warning it actually was. "That's better," Colonel Hutchinson said, stepping closer again. Elena noticed that his movements had become more aggressive, more purposeful. He was no longer simply testing boundaries. He was actively crossing them. "You people need to remember that this is a military installation, not some civilian workplace where you can do whatever you want." Elena's peripheral vision picked up movement in the hallway outside the office. Other personnel were going about their duties, unaware of the confrontation building inside. She calculated distances, timing, potential witnesses. These were the same calculations she had made before every mission, the mental preparation that had kept her alive in hostile territory. The colonel reached out again, this time with both hands, clearly intending to grab her by both shoulders in a display of physical dominance. Elena's training took over before her conscious mind could stop it. Her body shifted into a defensive stance so smoothly that it appeared almost casual, but her weight distribution and hand positioning had changed completely. She was no longer the submissive maintenance worker Colonel Hutchinson thought he was intimidating. Colonel Hutchinson's hands were halfway to their target when he noticed the change in Elena's posture. Something in her stillness, in the way she was looking at him, triggered a primitive warning system in his brain. For the first time since the encounter began, he hesitated, some part of his subconscious recognizing that he might be making a serious mistake. The moment of hesitation passed quickly, and Colonel Hutchinson's face hardened with renewed determination. Whatever he had sensed in Elena's posture, he dismissed as imagination. In his mind, she was still nothing more than a maintenance worker, someone far beneath his station and completely at his mercy. His hands continued their trajectory toward her shoulders, but now with added force, as if he needed to prove to himself that his initial instinct had been wrong. Elena watched his approach with the same clinical detachment she had once used to observe enemy movement through a rifle scope. Time seemed to slow as her mind automatically calculated angles, force vectors, and response options. Every detail became crystal clear. The way his fingers were positioned, the slight lean in his posture that indicated overconfidence, the fact that his feet were positioned poorly for balance. Colonel Hutchinson's hands made contact with her shoulders, gripping them with enough pressure to leave bruises on someone without Elena's conditioning. He leaned in closer, his face now inches from hers, his breath hot against her skin. This close, Elena could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure he derived from what he believed was complete dominance over another human being. "Now you're going to listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than his earlier shouting. Elena felt his grip tighten, his fingers digging into the muscle of her shoulders. "You're going to learn what happens to people who don't show proper respect to their betters." Elena's body remained perfectly still, but internally, every system was now operating at combat readiness. Her heart rate had actually decreased, dropping into the zone of optimal performance that her instructors had called the warrior's calm. Her vision had sharpened, Her hearing had become more acute, and her reaction time had decreased to the microsecond intervals that had once made the difference between mission success and mission failure. The colonel began to shake her slightly, his hands moving her shoulders back and forth in a gesture meant to emphasize his physical control over her. It was exactly the kind of mistake that Elena's hand-to-hand combat instructors had used to demonstrate the vulnerabilities of untrained aggression. By maintaining his grip while moving her body, Colonel Hutchinson had locked himself into a position from which escape would be difficult and defense would be nearly impossible. Elena could hear voices growing louder in the hallway outside the office. The lunch shift was beginning, which meant more personnel would be moving through the corridors. In her previous life, timing had been everything. Knowing when to strike, when to withdraw, when to call for support. She was acutely aware that the window for a quiet resolution to this situation was closing rapidly. The colonel's face was now close enough that Elena could count the small blood vessels in his eyes, could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with the metallic scent of anger and adrenaline. She had been this close to enemies before, but never while being forced to maintain a pretense of helplessness. The contradiction between her training and her current role was creating a tension that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. "You think you could just ignore me?" Colonel Hutchinson hissed, his grip tightening even further. Elena felt her shoulder joints compress under the pressure, but her expression remained unchanged. She had endured far worse during resistance training, had learned to show no reaction to pain or discomfort that might encourage her captors to increase their efforts. Elena's peripheral vision caught movement outside the office door. Someone was approaching, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that the interruption would force Colonel Hutchinson to release her and end this confrontation before it escalated further. But the footsteps passed by without pausing, and the colonel's attention remained focused entirely on his perceived dominance over her. The grip on her shoulders shifted, and Elena realized that Colonel Hutchinson was preparing to escalate the situation even further. His body language had changed, his stance becoming more aggressive, his breathing more rapid. Elena had seen this progression before in enemies who had moved from intimidation to active violence. She was running out of time to maintain her cover. The sound of boots echoing in the hallway grew louder, and Elena could distinguish at least 3 different sets of footsteps approaching the office area. Her mind automatically began cataloging the sounds, identifying the different gates, and estimating the number of potential witnesses who might soon observe what was happening. In her former life, situational awareness had been the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. Colonel Hutchinson seemed oblivious to the approaching footsteps, his attention completely focused on maintaining his physical dominance over Elena. His grip had shifted again, his thumbs now pressing into the soft tissue just below her collarbone in a way that was clearly intended to cause pain. Elena felt the pressure but showed no reaction, her face maintaining the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the encounter. The footsteps paused just outside the office, and Elena could hear the low murmur of conversation. She recognized one of the voices as belonging to Sergeant Marcus Chun, a communications specialist she had encountered several times during her maintenance rounds. The other voices were unfamiliar, but their tone suggested they were discussing routine military business, completely unaware of the situation unfolding just meters away. Colonel Hutchinson's breathing had become more labored, and Elena could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the office's air conditioning. His pupils were dilated, and his face had flushed with the kind of excitement that Elena had learned to recognize as dangerous. She had seen similar expressions on the faces of interrogators who had crossed the line from professional questioning to personal sadism. "Maybe what you need is a real lesson in military discipline," the colonel whispered, his voice carrying a tone that made Elena's skin crawl. His hands began to move from her shoulders, sliding down toward her arms in a way that was clearly intended to be threatening. Elena felt every muscle in her body tense as her training screamed at her to act, to end this confrontation with the swift and decisive force she had been taught to apply. The voices in the hallway grew slightly louder, and Elena caught fragments of conversation about equipment requisitions and duty rosters. Normal military business conducted by normal people who had no idea that one of their colleagues was being systematically intimidated and assaulted by a field-grade officer. The contrast between the mundane conversation outside and the escalating violence inside the office struck Elena as surreal. Colonel Hutchinson's hands continued their unwelcome journey down her arms, his grip alternately tightening and loosening in a pattern that Elena recognized as psychological warfare. He was trying to keep her off balance, to maintain uncertainty about his intentions while steadily escalating the physical component of his assault. It was a technique that might have worked on someone without Elena's training and experience. Elena's toolkit was still clutched in her right hand, its weight familiar and reassuring. The colonel seemed to have forgotten about it entirely, focused as he was on his physical dominance over her. Elena could visualize exactly how she would use it if the situation deteriorated further, could see the precise arc of movement that would end this confrontation immediately and decisively. The footsteps in the hallway began moving again, but instead of passing by, they seemed to be approaching the office more directly. Elena heard Sergeant Chin's voice more clearly now, discussing something about communication equipment that needed maintenance attention. For a moment, she wondered if he might enter the office and inadvertently interrupt the colonel's assault. But Colonel Hutchinson had also heard the approaching voices, and instead of releasing Elena as she had hoped, his grip tightened with renewed urgency. His eyes took on a desperate quality, the look of someone who realized his window of opportunity was narrowing, but was determined to press forward regardless. Elena recognized the expression immediately, had seen it in the faces of enemies who had been cornered and forced to make increasingly reckless decisions. The colonel's hands moved again, this time with an aggression that crossed the final line Elena had drawn in her mind. Her body began to respond automatically, muscle memory taking over before her conscious mind could intervene. 12 years of combat training compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity as Elena finally reached the point where maintaining her cover was no longer possible. The footsteps in the hallway had multiplied, and Elena could now distinguish at least 6 different voices engaged in conversation. What had started as a small group discussing routine maintenance had grown into a larger gathering, possibly a shift change or briefing that was taking place just outside Colonel Hutchinson's office. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that she was being assaulted by a senior officer while dozens of his subordinates conducted normal military business mere feet away. Colonel Hutchinson's hands had moved to her upper arms, his fingers digging into the muscle with enough force that Elena could feel her circulation being restricted. His face was now flushed with a combination of exertion and excitement, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. Elena had seen similar physiological responses in enemies who were preparing to escalate from restraint to active violence. "You're going to learn what happens to people who don't show proper respect," the colonel repeated, his voice now carrying a tremor of anticipation. His grip shifted again, and Elena realized that he was positioning himself to either shake her more violently or attempt to push her against the wall behind his desk. Either action would constitute a clear escalation that would trigger an automatic response from her combat training. Elena's mind operated on multiple levels simultaneously, a skill developed through years of complex military operations. Part of her consciousness continued to monitor the voices in the hallway, tracking the movement and conversation of potential witnesses. Another part calculated the precise force and angle that would be required to break free from the colonel's grip. A third part maintained the external appearance of submission while preparing for immediate action. The conversation outside had grown more animated, and Elena caught fragments that suggested someone was describing a recent training exercise. She heard Sergeant Chin's voice distinctly, along with what sounded like several junior enlisted personnel and possibly another NCO. The normal sounds of military life, continuing just beyond the office door, created a stark contrast to the violence being perpetrated inside. Colonel Hutchinson's grip tightened again, and Elena felt her arms being compressed against her torso in a way that would make movement difficult for someone without her training. But Elena's instructors had prepared her for exactly this type of restraint, had taught her to use an attacker's overconfidence against them. The colonel's superior position was actually putting him at a severe disadvantage, though he lacked the knowledge to realize it. Elena could feel her toolkit still secure in her right hand, its familiar weight providing both comfort and tactical options. The colonel had completely forgotten about it, focused entirely on his perceived physical dominance over her. His tunnel vision was another tactical error that Elena filed away for potential use, along with his poor foot positioning and the way his forward lean compromised his balance. The voices in the hallway seemed to be moving closer to the office, and Elena heard someone mention Colonel Hutchinson's name in passing. Her heart rate remained steady, but every sense was now operating at peak efficiency. She could smell the colonel's perspiration, could feel the slight tremor in his hands that indicated his adrenaline levels were spiking, could hear the subtle change in his breathing pattern that suggested he was preparing for his next move. Colonel Hutchinson leaned in closer, his face now inches from Elena's. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was meant to be intimidating, but which Elena read as desperation. He was a predator who had become accustomed to easy prey, someone who had never encountered genuine resistance to his abuse of power. The realization that he was about to discover his mistake filled Elena with a cold certainty about what was about to happen. The colonel's hands began to move again, this time with clear intent to escalate the physical assault. Elena felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that had always preceded combat in her previous life. Her peripheral vision sharpened, her hearing became more acute, and her muscles prepared for the explosive movement that would end this confrontation in seconds rather than minutes. In the hallway outside, the conversation had grown loud enough that individual words were clearly audible through the partially open door. Elena heard someone mention equipment inspections, duty schedules, and weekend training exercises. Normal military concerns discussed by normal people who had no idea that their commanding officer was about to learn a lesson that would fundamentally change his understanding of the people he believed he could intimidate with impunity. The moment arrived with crystalline clarity. Colonel Hutchinson's hands moved from Elena's arms toward her throat in a gesture that crossed every line of acceptable conduct and triggered every defensive protocol Elena had ever learned. Time compressed into the space between heartbeats as 12 years of elite military training condensed into a single point of decision. There would be no more restraint, no more pretense, no more hiding behind the gray jumpsuit of a maintenance worker. Elena's response was instantaneous and devastating. Her right hand, still gripping the toolkit, snapped upward in a precise arc that caught Colonel Hutchinson's reaching hands before they could make contact with her neck. The impact was surgical in its accuracy, striking the vulnerable joint where his wrist met his hand with enough force to send shock waves of pain radiating up his arm. The colonel's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as his hands were deflected away from their target. For the first time since the encounter began, he was experiencing genuine surprise rather than the controlled intimidation he had been orchestrating. Elena could see his mind struggling to process what had just happened, how a submissive maintenance worker had suddenly displayed the reflexes and precision of a trained combatant. But Elena wasn't finished. Her left hand moved with equal speed and precision, grasping Colonel Hutchinson's right wrist in a grip that her instructors had called the controller. Her fingers found the exact pressure points that would allow her to manipulate his entire arm with minimal effort, transforming his attempted assault into an opportunity for complete tactical dominance. The colonel tried to pull away, his face contorting with pain and confusion as Elena's grip tightened around his wrist. He had expected compliance, submission, fear. Instead, he found himself held immobile by someone whose strength and skill vastly exceeded anything he had imagined possible. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words emerged, only a strangled gasp of shock. Elena applied pressure with surgical precision, her fingers finding nerve clusters that sent waves of paralyzing pain up the colonel's arm. She had learned these techniques in classified training programs, had used them to extract information from enemies who possessed far more dangerous capabilities than the bureaucratic bully now writhing in her grasp. Colonel Hutchinson's face had gone pale, and sweat was beading on his forehead as he struggled to understand how completely the power dynamic had shifted. The voices in the hallway had grown even louder, and Elena could now distinguish individual conversations with perfect clarity. Someone was discussing weekend duty assignments. Another person was explaining maintenance procedures for communication equipment, and a third voice was reviewing security protocols. The normal rhythm of military life continued just outside the office door, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the violent confrontation taking place inside. Elena maintained her grip on the colonel's wrist while her other hand remained ready with the toolkit, prepared to deliver additional strikes if he attempted to escalate further. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, showing none of the strain that Colonel Hutchinson displayed as he struggled against her hold. The contrast between their physical states was stark and unmistakable. Colonel Hutchinson's free hand moved toward Elena in what might have been an attempt to break her grip or strike her, but Elena was already anticipating the movement. Her combat training had taught her to read an opponent's intentions through subtle shifts in posture and muscle tension, and she could see his next action forming before he was consciously aware of it himself. Elena's response was swift and decisive. She adjusted her grip on his captured wrist while simultaneously positioning herself to control his entire body. The movement was so smooth and professional that it looked almost effortless, the kind of technique that required thousands of hours of practice to execute with such precision. Colonel Hutchinson found himself completely immobilized, held in place by someone he had severely underestimated. The realization of his situation was beginning to dawn on Colonel Hutchinson's face, replacing his initial shock with something approaching genuine fear. Elena could see the exact moment when he understood that he was not dealing with an ordinary maintenance worker, when the reality of his mistake began to penetrate through his arrogance and assumptions. His eyes darted toward the office door, perhaps hoping for rescue or intervention, but the conversations in the hallway continued uninterrupted. Elena's voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of the deference or submission that had characterized her earlier responses. Instead, it held the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, tinged with the controlled menace of a professional who had been pushed beyond the limits of patience. "Sir," she said, her tone perfectly calm despite the violence of the situation, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action." The change in Colonel Hutchinson's demeanor was immediate and complete. The arrogant confidence that had driven his assault evaporated as Elena's controlled voice carried implications he was only beginning to understand. His captured wrist throbbed with pain from her precise grip, and his attempts to move were met with increased pressure that sent shooting pains up his entire arm. For the first time in the encounter, he was experiencing genuine helplessness. Elena could see the colonel's mind racing, trying to reconcile the submissive maintenance worker he had been intimidating with the highly trained combatant who now held him immobilized. His eyes searched her face for some explanation, some clue that would help him understand how dramatically he had misjudged the situation. The gray jumpsuit and quiet demeanor that had marked her as an easy target now seemed like an elaborate disguise, concealing something far more dangerous. The conversations in the hallway had grown more distinct, and Elena could now identify specific individuals by their voices. Sergeant Chen was explaining something about radio frequency protocols to what sounded like newly assigned personnel. A corporal was discussing supply requisitions with another NCO. Someone was describing the proper procedures for equipment maintenance in technical detail that suggested an instructor addressing students. Colonel Hutchinson attempted to speak, his voice emerging as a strained whisper that betrayed both his physical discomfort and his psychological shock. "What are you?" he managed, the question carrying layers of meaning that even he probably didn't fully comprehend. Elena could see in his eyes the dawning realization that everything he had assumed about her was fundamentally wrong. Elena's response was delivered in the same calm tone she had once used when briefing senior officers on mission parameters. "Someone you should not have touched, sir." Her grip on his wrist remained steady and controlled, applying exactly the amount of pressure necessary to maintain dominance without causing permanent damage. It was a level of restraint that spoke to extensive training in controlled application of force. The colonel's free hand trembled as he raised it, whether in surrender or preparation for another attack. Elena couldn't be sure. But her training had taught her never to assume surrender until an opponent was completely neutralized, and Colonel Hutchinson still possessed the capability to escalate if he chose to do so. Elena shifted her stance slightly, preparing to respond to whatever action he might attempt. The voices outside grew momentarily louder as someone approached the office door more closely. Elena heard footsteps pause just outside, and for a moment, she wondered if the confrontation was about to gain witnesses. But the footsteps moved on after a brief hesitation, their owner apparently deciding not to interrupt whatever business was taking place inside the colonel's office. Elena could feel Colonel Hutchinson's pulse through her grip on his wrist, rapid and irregular with the stress of his situation. His breathing had become shallow and labored, and she could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the office's air conditioning. These were the physiological responses of someone whose nervous system was struggling to process an unexpected reversal of power dynamics. The colonel's eyes darted toward the office door, and Elena could read his thoughts as clearly as if he had spoken them aloud. He was calculating whether to call for help, whether to attempt to frame this situation as an attack by a deranged maintenance worker rather than the consequence of his own criminal behavior. Elena had seen similar calculations in the eyes of enemies who had been captured and were weighing their options for escape or deception. Elena's voice carried a note of warning that was unmistakable despite its quiet delivery. "I would not recommend calling for assistance, sir." Her words carried the weight of someone who had extensive experience in managing complex tactical situations, someone who had already considered every possible outcome and prepared appropriate responses. The conversation in the hallway shifted, and Elena heard someone mention Colonel Hutchinson's name specifically. Apparently, one of the personnel outside was looking for him, possibly for a scheduled meeting or briefing. Elena could see the colonel's face change as he heard his name spoken, his expression shifting between hope and terror as he realized that rescue and humiliation were equally possible outcomes. Elena maintained her grip while allowing her peripheral vision to monitor the hallway through the partially open door. Her training had taught her to manage multiple variables simultaneously, to maintain control over her immediate opponent while remaining aware of changing environmental factors. The approaching conversation represented both opportunity and danger, depending on how Colonel Hutchinson chose to handle the situation. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer, and Elena could distinguish the voice of Captain Rebecca Torres, one of the base's administrative officers. She was asking about the colonel's availability for a briefing scheduled in 10 minutes, her tone suggesting routine military business rather than any awareness of the crisis taking place inside the office. Captain Torres knocked on the office door frame, her voice carrying the professional courtesy typical of military interactions between officers. "Colonel Hutchinson, sir, do you have a moment for the logistics briefing?" The sound seemed to snap the colonel back to awareness of his surroundings, his eyes widening as he realized that his current situation was about to become significantly more complicated. Elena could feel the colonel's muscles tense as he prepared to respond, and she applied subtle pressure to his captured wrist to remind him of his precarious position. Her message was clear. Any attempt to misrepresent the situation or call for help would result in immediate and painful consequences. The colonel's face contorted as he struggled between his desire for rescue and his growing understanding of Elena's capabilities. "Just a moment, Captain," Colonel Hutchinson managed to call out, his voice strained but attempting normalcy. Elena could hear the effort it took for him to maintain composure, could see the sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to project authority while being held immobile by someone he had grossly underestimated. Elena's grip remained steady and controlled, her positioning allowing her to maintain dominance while staying out of direct view from the doorway. Her training in close-quarters combat had included extensive instruction in managing multiple opponents and witnesses, and she was automatically implementing protocols designed for exactly this type of complex situation. Captain Torres seemed to accept the colonel's response without suspicion, her footsteps moving slightly away from the door as she waited in the hallway. Elena could hear her engaging in quiet conversation with some of the other personnel who had gathered outside, discussing routine administrative matters while unknowingly providing cover for the confrontation taking place just meters away. Colonel Hutchinson's breathing had become more labored, and Elena could see him struggling with the realization that his window for controlling the narrative was rapidly closing. His eyes met hers with a combination of fear and desperate calculation, as if he was trying to determine whether she would actually follow through on the implied threat of her controlled violence. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. You have approximately 30 seconds to decide how you want to handle this situation, sir. Her tone suggested that she had extensive experience in giving ultimatums to people who found themselves at severe tactical disadvantages. The colonel's captured hand had begun to tremble, whether from pain, fear, or the strain of his awkward position. Elena could feel his pulse through her grip, rapid and irregular with the stress of someone whose carefully constructed world of assumed superiority was collapsing around him. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, as if his mind was unable to formulate words adequate to his situation. In the hallway, Captain Torres was reviewing what sounded like supply schedules with one of the NCOs, her voice carrying the routine efficiency of someone handling familiar administrative duties. The normalcy of the conversation created an almost surreal contrast to the life-changing confrontation taking place inside the office, highlighting how completely Colonel Hutchinson's reality had diverged from that of his subordinates. Elena could see the exact moment when the colonel's resistance finally broke completely. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and his face took on the expression of someone who had finally accepted the inevitability of consequences he had never anticipated. The arrogance and entitlement that had driven his assault were replaced by something approaching genuine terror as he realized the scope of his mistake. 20 seconds, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying no emotion but absolute certainty. She had learned long ago that the most effective threats were delivered with complete calm, that emotional displays were often counterproductive when dealing with individuals who needed to make rational decisions under extreme pressure. Colonel Hutchinson's eyes darted toward the door again, but this time Elena could see that he was no longer calculating rescue scenarios. Instead, he appeared to be considering how to minimize the damage to his career and reputation that would inevitably result from this encounter. His face had gone pale, and she could see him beginning to understand that his actions had set in motion consequences that would extend far beyond this office. Captain Torres called out again, her voice carrying a note of mild impatience that suggested she had other duties to attend to. Colonel Hutchinson, the briefing materials are ready whenever you are. The timing of her reminder seemed to catalyze something in the colonel's decision-making process, as if the approaching deadline had forced him to confront the reality of his situation. Elena watched as Colonel Hutchinson's remaining defiance crumbled entirely, his body language shifting from aggressive resistance to complete submission. She could see in his eyes the dawning realization that he was about to face consequences that would fundamentally alter not just this encounter, but potentially his entire military career. Colonel Hutchinson's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, his words carrying the weight of complete capitulation. "Please," he said, the single word containing more genuine emotion than anything he had expressed during his earlier assault. Elena could see that his resistance had finally collapsed entirely, replaced by the kind of fear that came from understanding how catastrophically he had misjudged both the situation and the person he had chosen to victimize. Elena maintained her grip for several more seconds, allowing the colonel to fully absorb the implications of his position before gradually reducing the pressure on his wrist. Her release was as controlled and precise as her initial response had been, demonstrating the same professional competence that had once made her invaluable in combat operations. Even in mercy, she projected absolute dominance. The colonel pulled his freed hand back against his chest, cradling the wrist that still throbbed with pain from Elena's expertly applied pressure. His eyes remained fixed on her face with a mixture of fear and dawning respect, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time since she had entered his office. The gray jumpsuit and maintenance tools that had once marked her as beneath his notice now seemed like an elaborate disguise, concealing capabilities he was only beginning to comprehend. Elena stepped back slightly, creating distance while maintaining her ready stance. Her positioning allowed her to monitor both the colonel and the doorway, keeping track of Captain Torres's presence in the hallway, while ensuring that Colonel Hutchinson remained aware of her continued tactical advantage. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, carrying none of the deference she had displayed earlier. Colonel Hutchinson's breathing remained labored, and Elena could see him struggling to process what had just occurred. His worldview, built on assumptions of hierarchy and privilege, had been shattered in the space of seconds by someone he had dismissed as powerless. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face as he tried to reconcile the maintenance worker he had been intimidating with the trained combatant who had effortlessly neutralized his assault. In the hallway, Captain Torres was growing noticeably impatient, her voice carrying a sharper edge as she called out again. "Sir, I really do need to brief you on these logistics issues before the 1400 meeting." The urgency in her tone seemed to penetrate through Colonel Hutchinson's shock, forcing him to confront the immediate necessity of maintaining some semblance of normal military function. Elena's voice remained calm and controlled, but now carried undertones of authority that hadn't been present during her earlier submissive responses. "I suggest you attend to your duties, sir." The words were delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that was somehow more threatening than any explicit threat would have been. Colonel Hutchinson could hear in her tone the voice of someone accustomed to command, someone whose current role as a maintenance worker was clearly temporary and voluntary. The colonel nodded quickly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as he struggled to regain some measure of composure. His eyes darted between Elena and the doorway, and she could see him calculating how to handle the transition from this confrontation back to normal military business. The challenge of maintaining his facade of authority while his hands still shook from their encounter seemed almost insurmountable. Elena moved toward her maintenance cart with the same fluid precision she had demonstrated throughout the confrontation, but now her movements carried an unmistakable martial quality that made it impossible to mistake her for an ordinary civilian employee. Her toolkit found its place among her supplies with military efficiency, every action deliberate and controlled. Colonel Hutchinson cleared his throat and called out toward the hallway, his voice carrying forced normalcy that didn't quite mask the underlying tension. "Come in, Captain Torres." His invitation sounded strained, but it was functional enough to maintain the pretense of routine military business. Elena could see the tremendous effort it was costing him to project even this minimal level of authority. As Captain Torres's footsteps approached the office, Elena continued organizing her equipment with methodical precision. But now her posture had changed completely from the deferential maintenance worker who had entered the office earlier. Her spine was straight, her movements carried military bearing, and her overall presence projected the unmistakable confidence of someone with extensive combat training. Captain Torres appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of an efficient officer handling routine administrative duties. Her eyes swept the office, taking in Colonel Hutchinson's disheveled appearance and slightly flushed face, then settling on Elena with a casual recognition typical of brief military interactions. Elena met Captain Torres's gaze with a level of direct eye contact that was completely different from her earlier behavior. There was no submission, no deference, no attempt to minimize her presence. Instead, Her look carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and no reason to fear authority. The transformation was so complete that Captain Torres paused for a moment, as if something about Elena's demeanor had triggered a subconscious recognition. Captain Torres entered the office with her usual brisk efficiency, but Elena could see the exact moment when military recognition kicked in. The captain's eyes widened slightly as she took in Elena's transformed posture and bearing. Her experienced eye automatically cataloging details that spoke to extensive combat training. The gray jumpsuit could no longer disguise what Elena had become, and Captain Torres's expression shifted from casual acknowledgement to sharp professional interest. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Captain Torres said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of sudden understanding. Elena felt a familiar sensation as her real identity emerged from beneath months of carefully maintained cover. The captain's recognition was immediate and complete, her tone shifting to carry the respect automatically accorded to someone with Elena's service record. Colonel Hutchinson's face went completely white as he heard Elena's rank and surname spoken aloud. Elena could see his mind racing as he tried to process the implications, try to understand how completely he had misjudged not just her capabilities, but her entire background. The maintenance worker he had been assaulting was revealed as a decorated combat veteran whose service record likely exceeded his own. Captain Torres stepped further into the office, her folder temporarily forgotten as she processed the scene before her. Her eyes moved between Elena's military bearing and Colonel Hutchinson's obvious distress, and Elena could see the captain's analytical mind working to understand what had transpired. Years of military experience had taught Captain Torres to read situations quickly and accurately. Elena straightened to full attention, her posture now displaying the bearing that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous theaters of operation. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone reporting to a superior officer. Elena had maintained her cover for 8 months, but now that it was blown, she felt an unexpected relief at being able to drop the pretense. Captain Torres's expression hardened as she looked more closely at Colonel Hutchinson, noting his disheveled appearance, his trembling hands, and the unmistakable signs of someone who had just experienced a significant shock. Her years of experience in military investigations had taught her to recognize the aftermath of confrontations, and she was clearly beginning to piece together what had occurred. "Staff Sergeant," Captain Torres said, her voice carrying both respect and concern. "Are you all right?" The question was delivered with the kind of protective authority that senior officers extended to subordinates who might have been subjected to inappropriate treatment. Elena could see that Captain Torres was prepared to take whatever action might be necessary to address the situation. Elena's response was delivered with military precision, her voice carrying none of the submission that had characterized her earlier interactions with Colonel Hutchinson. "Iam fine, ma'am. The situation has been resolved." Her words carried layers of meaning that Captain Torres, with her extensive military experience, would be able to interpret accurately. Colonel Hutchinson seemed to shrink further into himself as the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. His assault on Elena had been transformed from what he had perceived as the intimidation of a powerless civilian into an attack on a decorated combat veteran. The implications for his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom were beginning to dawn on him with crushing clarity. Captain Torres moved closer to Elena, her protective instincts clearly engaged. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez has an exemplary service record," she said, her words directed toward Colonel Hutchinson, but clearly intended for Elena's benefit as well. 12 years with the Rangers, multiple combat deployments, and decorations that most officers would envy. Her tone carried an unmistakable warning about the consequences of mistreating such a distinguished veteran. Elena could see Colonel Hutchinson's face cycling through various expressions as he absorbed this information. The maintenance worker he had been terrorizing was revealed as someone whose combat experience and military achievements far exceeded his own administrative career. The reversal of their actual relative status within the military hierarchy was so complete that it bordered on the absurd. The office fell silent as the three military professionals processed the implications of the revealed situation. Elena maintained her position at attention. Captain Torres continued her protective assessment, and Colonel Hutchinson struggled with the catastrophic realization of what he had attempted to do and how completely he had failed. Captain Torres turned toward Colonel Hutchinson with an expression that promised serious consequences. "Colonel, I believe we need to discuss this situation in detail." Her voice carried the authority of someone who would not be dismissed or intimidated, someone who took the welfare of distinguished veterans very seriously indeed. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar courage in real life. Elena's transformation from invisible maintenance worker to respected combat veteran had taken less than an hour, but the lessons learned by everyone present would last considerably longer. In the end, respect was something that could never be assumed but always had to be earned, and Elena Vasquez had earned hers through years of service that commanded recognition from all who truly understood its value.